received Kingdom Hearts 2 as a Christmas present back in 2006, a few months after it was released in North America. As a kid, I loved Kingdom Hearts 1 to death, and after receiving the highly anticipated sequel to my favorite game, the word ecstatic is an understatement to how I felt at the time. I instantly fell in love with KH2. Over the course of the year, I slowly completed the entire game with a 2-hour video game curfew on the weekends. And after that, I replayed it, again and again and again. As I grew up, Kingdom Hearts 2 continued being the single game that I would repeatedly come back to regardless of time. I may take a few prolonged breaks from playing the game once in a while, but I always find myself eventually booting up the disc eager to experience it all over again. When the HD ports were released, I finally got my hands on the final mix version that I've seen online and desired so much, and it's no surprise playing it made me fall in love with the game all over again. Over the course of the past decade, I've likely spent upwards of 3,000 hours invested in this game alone, completed literal hundreds of playthroughs, 100%ed everything including the gummy ships, and explored just about as much as you can possibly do with a single game. The reason I'm saying all of this is to give you some perspective with this video. While I wouldn't consider myself the best KH2 player by any stretch, it would also be disingenuous of me to say that I'm not at the very least experienced and knowledgeable about this game. While that may suggest that I'm a decent candidate for an unbiased critique, you should also know that this game was a large part of my childhood, and perhaps even my long experience with the game can influence certain judgments. Therefore, my arguments in this video may be reflective of this, and you should know that before watching. The previous introduction is also relevant to what I'm about to say. To me, KH2 is my favorite game of all time, and nearly flawless. But as an unbiased reviewer, it has many things I can critique and is far from perfect. This may sound contradictory, and the reasons for it are complicated, which is why I wanted to make this video. I'll be primarily talking about the gameplay, if that wasn't clear yet. The story of Kingdom Hearts, as you likely know, is a whole other beast that I may explore one day, but definitely isn't something I want to get into right now. In my opinion, Kingdom Hearts 2's biggest, most glaring flaw is that it isn't good enough at showing the player that it is a good game. I know this answer sounds like a cop-out, like one of those interview questions about what's your greatest weakness, and you flip that around and make it sound like a strength. My greatest weakness is I'm too much of a perfectionist. And maybe to an extent you might be right. As I mentioned before, my bias for the game might be unintentionally peeking through, but allow me to elaborate on this first. To talk about this, I have to highlight KH2's greatest strength, which lies in the combat system. Whether intentional or not, the combat system of KH2 flows incredibly well. Almost everything has some sort of meaning behind them, whether it's a drive form, a summon, magic, limits, basic combos, combo modifiers, and so on. Many of these options can be used in tandem for interesting effects once you understand how they work. For example, magnet magic has an effect of pulling enemies in and dealing damage when they get trapped. Combine this with a multi-hit attack such as Final Genie's Limit, and you get a cool crowd control effect that pulls enemies in and out of the magnet, dealing damage constantly. Equipping Combo Master allows you to continue combos even when you don't hit targets, which people have discovered works well with Reflect, a spell that by itself doesn't hit enemies, so you can't continue a combo after casting the spell. But with Combo Master, you can string together beautiful looking combos with Reflect to tear through health bars. You may consider some of these pieces of tech advanced, or even as elementary knowledge, depending on how much you know about KH2. The point I'm trying to make is that Kingdom Hearts 2 has these possible interactions and much more, and at its peak, the options given to you flow beautifully together, creating this incredibly cohesive system with endless amounts of choices and decision making to explore. However, the game doesn't tell you this. Nothing about this game tells you this. The reason you may know about these things is almost certainly because you watched a speedrunner or influencer play KH2, and those people learned about these things through years of personal experience and community efforts. Kingdom Hearts 2 as a game never fully explores its own incredible system. It comes close with some of the post-game content, but even there the motivation to dive deeper into the system is hit or miss depending on the player. So let's talk a little bit about why this is, why there exists features in the game that actively discourages players from fully exploring its mechanics. The first most obvious and perhaps most shallow problem is the argument of difficulty. You've likely heard something similar to this before. Aside from critical mode, the game is too easy to button mash through, therefore you never truly get incentivized to dive deeper into the combat system. While this is true to some extent, I think the problem runs a little deeper than this, as I've witnessed even first-time critical mode players tackling the game in similar fashions. Button mash until you win, and if you can't, grind some levels and try again. Furthermore, I don't think having a variety of difficulty options is a bad thing. Certain players prefer easier playthroughs so they can focus more on other aspects of the game, and that's perfectly fine, while other players may play harder difficulties for a fun challenge and a deeper exploration of the gameplay. There's more to this argument than just difficulty. I've seen newer players confused at all the praise KH2 receives when they first complete it. They don't understand what's so special about a typical button-mashing hack-and-slash game. And why would they? The game never truly teaches you anything substantial, and when stuck, people come up with one of two justifications. Either they're missing something deeper in this supposed game for kids, or they're just underleveled and need to grind. Occam's razor dictates that people generally gravitate towards the simpler explanation, so the final conclusion most arrive at is simply because they need to grind in this action RPG. It's a perfectly reasonable one. So what is it exactly that the game is actually failing to communicate that results in this common scenario? I think there's a few issues here. First of all, growth abilities being locked behind drive forms means that it is optional to obtain. In other words, the game can never guarantee a player has a certain movement ability. This is likely the reason why the level design in Kingdom Hearts 2 has noticeably less verticality in general exploration than its predecessor. Perhaps part of it is because the team decided to focus on large, flat arenas to work alongside the enemies in combat, but the fact that Cavern of Remembrance, the optional area in the game, has incredibly in-depth platforming and exploration challenges most likely implies that they were simply limited due to the restrictions of optional movement abilities. The more important implication of this decision is that not only is exploration restricted, but so are bosses and the ways they can operate. You cannot have a boss that forces you to have glide to dodge an attack in the main game. They can't require you to have some sort of iframe dodge like quick run or dodge roll. You can't fight someone who goes physically out of reach without high jump and aerial dodge. Even worse, some bosses are tediously difficult without these movement options, and most endgame fights would expect you to at the very least have some version of a ground dodge and an aerial dodge to make them reasonable. In this way, the game encourages you to grind drive forms, an extremely boring and repetitive task most of the time. It's an awkward middle ground. The full movement options that Sora receives after max leveling all the forms is never fully explored aside from debatably post-game content, and yet you should be expected to level up some drive forms in order to make certain fights doable. You can argue that players will naturally level up the forms as they proceed through the game, and perhaps that's what the intentional design choice was, for bosses to require some low-level growth abilities but nothing beyond that. The problem with this is twofold. Firstly, different players play the game in different ways. Because of this restriction, a player who doesn't use a lot of drive forms, or a specific drive form for a specific growth ability, can be unknowingly punished later, all because their playstyle didn't conform to what the game expected. Secondly, forms are difficult to level, and oftentimes it's not entirely obvious how to level said form. There does exist simple explanations in the game, but the messages are so hidden that most players wouldn't discover them during their first playthroughs. I know it took me several years to even realize the game told me how to level them up, and that was long after I had looked up tutorials online. More importantly, the point here is of missed potential. Sora's maxed out growth abilities has some of the best controls in any KH game. If these abilities were given to you throughout the story, and endgame bosses and levels require you to have them, we could have seen a much more thorough exploration of movement and dodging mechanics. Perhaps something akin to the unblockable attacks we see from bosses in KH3. This brings me to my next issue, which may come as a surprise to some. Boss and enemy design in KH2 is often underwhelming for the amount of complexity in its combat system. This is a bold claim to make, so let me elaborate more on this point. Specifically, I think there's two primary reasons that contribute to this issue. One, there aren't enough motivators to teach the players about the system, and two, the way bosses work in KH2 are often too susceptible to exploitation. The first point has to do with this idea of implicit teaching. Kingdom Hearts 2 doesn't do a very good job at showing you exactly what its mechanics are or how to use them. Almost every single tutorial screen or description in the game is extremely vague and barely scratches the surface of what is possible. Try the different commands that appear with each summon. Limits are abilities that consume Sora's MP and are executed with party members. Drives are powerful as it absorbs party members' strength, but party members disappear while transformed. The problem with these tutorials should be obvious. They tell you virtually nothing about the mechanics themselves, and some of them contain almost irrelevant information. Of course, tutorials shouldn't show you everything. If KH2 had done that, then much of the game would be bogged down by tutorial screens, and the information may seem overwhelming to the player. You could say that Kingdom Hearts 2 encourages you to, instead, experiment on your own and discover how these mechanics work. And while that is, in theory, something that could work, practically I rarely see many players utilizing their tools at all. Maybe it's some preconceived notion that because KH1 could be played as mash X to win hack and slash, then so could KH2, or it's not immediately obvious how to use these options to your advantage, so most players try them once, then never use them again. Regardless of what the reason is, it's pretty obvious this design choice didn't work. I think KH2 could have avoided this by giving the players a little push in the right direction, implicitly teach the players through gameplay. It's actually something I see a lot of indie games nowadays do well. Celeste's first chapter introduces a traffic block that kills you when you jump too fast, serving as a tutorial about how to use its momentum to launch yourself, and even introduces the importance that momentum will play throughout the rest of the game. Hollow Knight places a breakable wall right next to a money rock in the first area, which many will end up hitting unintentionally, and shows the player to be on the lookout for these hidden secrets. The Witness is literally an entire game based on this concept, using context clues and perspective to figure out the puzzles. KH2 could have done something like this, introduce the mechanic to the player by encouraging or forcing them to use it in some situation. I want to make it clear that I'm not saying the game should spoon feed you every single thing. Instead, it should have eased the player towards the beginning of the game into exploring their options. Place the players in situations that are difficult to get by without using, say, Chicken Little when you first receive him. Encourage them to use Chicken Little and find out about how useful he is as a crowd control tool. This doesn't have to be done for everything, as long as this idea that keep your options as an open possibility is communicated. Bosses in mid to late game can still be as unique as they are. I don't think restrictions on gameplay options is ever a good thing to do in action games, but for the sake of learning a complicated system, it's worth having a few battles act as a way to teach and push the players in the right direction. Grim Reaper tries to accomplish this task. This is one of the only fights in the game that forces you to use magic, which exposes the players to the potential uses of the offensive spells. However, this fight comes too late in the game to where most players most likely already have an established playstyle, and it doesn't really show the utility of magic outside of fighting Port Royal pirates, an enemy that pretty much never appears again after you defeat the Grim Reaper. As a result, many find this fight obnoxious rather than enlightening. Why can't I mash X to win? Why do I have to change my playstyle for a single fight? I don't like it is the general sentiment that I get from others about this fight. This sort of fight should have been in the very beginning when magic is first introduced, but its appearance does too little too late into the game. With just the raw mechanics of KH2, as in attacking, guarding, and dodging, the game is beatable. In fact, quite easily beatable in anything below critical mode, and even with critical mode is completely reasonable to accomplish with minimal grinding and some patience to learn some fights. This is in part due to how many bosses work in KH2, but I'll get to that later. For now, I want to highlight this because playing KH2 in this way is how most blind playthroughs go, at least from my experience of watching others, ignoring drives, summons, limits, and most magic spells. While towards the beginning of the game this style of gameplay is reasonable as you have little tools to work with and bosses focus more on positioning and precision with slower, less aggressive movements, dealing with fights in endgame and postgame in the same fashion wasn't ever as fun or satisfying to me, and often devolves into some sort of loop or cheese. Once again, I'll get more into this later. I think Kingdom Hearts 3's Limit Cut and Secret Episodes actually does this a lot better, with Sora's free flow combos and cancel windows. Yeah, I'm comparing KH3 to KH2 now, the tables really have turned. I'll use this opportunity as a segue into a point I want to make. While KH3's optional fights are better designed than 2FM's, many of them feel a bit mechanical after learning them. I think what contributes to this is the defense armor the bosses have when they're not staggered, which leads to a feeling of almost something akin to turn-based combat. You attack, then the boss attacks, then you attack, then the boss attacks. Any attempt at self-expression, such as using extra reprisals, or using water for iframes, as cool as they may look, does very little in a practical sense. The fights quite literally force you to conform to their moves. While this may seem nitpicky, it's one of my few complaints with KH3's optional bosses. I understand why those fights were designed like this, the system for that game wouldn't work otherwise, but I mainly bring this up because I think it serves as an excellent comparison to peak KH2's combat with bosses. Kingdom Hearts 2's combat rarely has this feeling of trading turns to me, perhaps because bosses can be damaged well even if they aren't staggered. This is in part due to the multitude of unique options available to you. There are ways to sneak in damage during bosses' attacks, cut them short, or even exploit their own mechanic against them using your toolset in a smart way. As a result, most fights often feel like there's very little downtime where you're doing nothing and are more fast-paced and intense. In essence, all bosses are turn-based. Every time you attack, it's your turn, and every time the boss attacks, it's their turn. I think what makes it different for me is simply the amount of downtime between each turn. This is why I think Data Riku is one of the best fights in Cage 3. His attacks are fast and random, but he has multiple openings to intercept and cut his attacks short. There's less downtime between each move, and that makes the fight become more of a fast-paced flow of trading attacks, as opposed to taking turns. An example from Cage 2 would be Data Larkin, one of my favorite bosses in the entire series. Larkin has her own set openings, but there's many unique ways to sneak in damage with Reflect, or smart uses of crowd control on her clones, and the entire fight flows beautifully from one move to another, creating a constant stream of trading attacks, dodging, and swift decision making for every single move. For a bad example, look at something like Data Zigbar. The only viable way to get damage on him is to stagger him with his own bullets. As a result, much of the fight feels like a repetitive turn-based battle, where you use Reflect until he's open, then attack, back away, and repeat. I went on this huge tangent to shit on Cage 3 obviously, but also to highlight this important point. Many of Cage 2's bosses can be played this way, and in my opinion, it's a lot of fun to do so. However, the boss designs themselves hardly ever encourage this style of gameplay, so the average player will likely never discover it unless they're bored and want to experiment, something someone would maybe do after beating the game. All this is to bring up my second point. There are bosses in Cage 2, primarily in the endgame, that are too easy to unintentionally cheese and actively fall into these boss loops, where you can exploit their mechanics to have them repeat the same pattern of attacks over and over again. As a result, any encouragement to explore other options are often ignored in favor of defeating a boss by looping them forever, a strategy that is often foolproof and not difficult to pull off, even unintentionally. If you've watched up to this point, you likely already know what revenge value is, and if you don't, here's a nifty little video I made you can check out. The concept of revenge value has been talked about over and over again, with many praising its implementation to make bosses consistent. However, I believe that in the same way these invisible counters may elevate these bosses, they also expose some of the more unfair and exploitable aspects of these fights. Perhaps the biggest issue with revenge value is that the game practically expects you to understand it, at least a rudimentary version of it, to deal with end and post-game boss fights. This is because many bosses retaliate way too quickly on revenge, the worst of which comes to mind is Data Roxas, who has a random instantaneous retaliation if you hit his revenge value in his second phase. This attack is undodgeable, unreactable, kills you instantly on level 1, and the only way to counter it is to spam Reflect and Hope. In the shoes of a new player, I can totally see how this can be frustrating, especially if they have no concept of revenge value at all. How am I supposed to react to this? It comes out instantly and in the middle of my combo. This attack is bullshit. Honestly, I would react in the same way. These are the types of mechanics that encourage players to loop the bosses or defeat them via some form of cheese, because playing the fight otherwise means having to deal with these unfair attacks. Even if the retaliation isn't necessarily unavoidable, many are still extremely fast and can only be dealt with if you know for sure it's coming. New players may eventually figure out that, hey, the boss retaliates after a certain number of hits, or they might not, depending on how astute they are. Either way, this means that these fights are a game of trial and error until the player figures out exactly how the boss works, or just give up and resort to grinding, something I see a lot of people do. You can argue that this is how boss fights should proceed. You should be rewarded for learning the fights through trial and error. The reason I can't entirely agree with this point is the same reason why I despise the elitist attitude so many people have with their favorite games. Surely you've heard this argument before. Whenever someone criticizes a design choice for being unfair, there's always that one person who responds, "Hey, that's not a bad thing, you're just bad at the game. Get good." While sometimes this may be true and the claim was preemptive, it's also commonly used as a cheap way to dismiss valid criticism, attributing a genuinely unfair mechanic to simply not being good enough. I think difficulty can come in many forms, but if the idea of difficulty means to bash your head at a fight until you inevitably memorize everything or notice some minor mechanic about the fight that the game never explicitly bothers explaining to you, and this means you've supposedly gotten good, then I believe that fight is just as deserving of criticism as any other. While I think there should be a learning curve for difficult fights, it shouldn't be a game of trials and memorization, especially with the combat system 2FM has in place. Instead, fights should operate on a combination of of knowledge, reaction speed, and quick decision making. Bosses should have reasonable telegraphs for attacks, and reacting appropriately and choosing a viable option to deal with said attack should be rewarded. Once again, Kingdom Hearts 3 does this well with a few of its data battles. Upon hitting revenge value, the enemy teleports away or does a telegraphed attack rather than retaliating with no warning. Of course, there are also fights in that game that does this rather poorly. Fights like Vanitas has the boss in a scripted pattern, and some attacks are only reactable if you memorize that they're coming, but I digress, this isn't about KH3. Now I want to make it clear that I'm not saying every fight in 2FM is like this. In fact, most are not, and some are even great examples of what good bosses should look like. Most of these issues are primarily concerned with end and post-game content, the data battles and Terra, so perhaps as a whole this isn't as big of a deal as I make it out to be. But my counter-argument to this is that Kingdom Hearts 2's combat system is also at its best during this time, where you have the most freedom in which options you want to use and how you want to use them. This also doesn't change the way certain fights work in the game, and whenever a boss has a supposedly unfair mechanic, players will naturally look for alternative ways to approach them, and looping a boss is often as simple as forcing them to retaliate, avoid the retaliation, attack them, rinse and repeat. It's very intuitive and in my opinion pretty boring most of the time. Terra can be looped as simply as hitting his revenge value, or not hitting his revenge value in his final phase. Axel can be looped with Reflect or by hitting his revenge value on the fire floor. Data Zigbar can be looped by simply reflecting 2 rounds of bullets back at him, an almost completely brainless reflect spam fight. Data Zaldin can be looped for over half the fight by blocking his lances, mashing triangle, then spamming X for jumps. A truly riveting experience. For some of these fights it's easier to accidentally loop them. Terra practically falls into a loop by himself if he isn't in bike phase. So now we arrive at the complex subject of how much responsibilities should players have to make the game fun for themselves, but I'm not sure if that's a discussion I want to get into at this point in time. I think ultimately this issue, compounded with the fact that most players never discover half of the options available to them, encourages less creative play, and that is what leads to missed potential. I will acknowledge that it's possible my own experience with the game is affecting my judgment on these fights. I know optimal strategies of how to approach each one, and my criticism is often a presumption that the player is playing on critical mode or level 1. Perhaps to someone playing the game blind, these fights are challenging, but messing up isn't as punishing to the point of invoking feelings of unfairness or frustration, and that is where a lot of my points then become irrelevant. If what I've said comes off as a little elitist, I apologize, that wasn't my intention. I think the crux of my argument is this. Regardless of how you play KH2, eliminating unfairness in bosses can never be a bad thing, and the best way to find issues in boss fights is to fight them on the hardest difficulty. On an easier difficulty, you may shrug off attacks as they hit you and they don't kill you. However, if you're in danger of dying in a single hit and the attack from the boss isn't fair, it creates a lasting impact. It's also easy to forget that KH2 has bosses other than organization members, and some of these fights are fun as well. Many large bosses operate as giant floating hitboxes with certain scripted moves, and some of these fights are great to experiment on, if you know the game system well. Or they're hot garbage. Other bosses range from decent to fun, but many have some problematic moves as well. Experiment can be extremely aggressive with little chance of recovery, and nothing about the fight indicates that you have to throw his body into his head to recomplete him. Shan Yu's bird as a separate target can interrupt your combos and oftentimes go straight through your guard. Genie Jafar post DM phase is almost impossible to survive on level 1 as his barrage of attacks don't really ever stop for any reasonable openings before he DMs again. Obviously, if you knew the game's mechanics well, you can come up with ways to deal with these fights. Using panic options, the game never teaches you to deal with the experiment. Use Mulan's red rocket to quickly dodge the bird in Shan Yu, or move up against a wall to ensure your guard works. Use carpet mechanics to completely skip over Jafar's DM by dealing certain amounts of damage to him in his HP phases. But to the average player, they won't ever learn about these, and if you recall at the beginning of this video, I claimed that KH2 from my perspective is an incredible game, because I know enough about this game's mechanics to say that with confidence. However, as an unbiased reviewer, it's difficult for me to say whether KH2 does its job well, and at the very least leaves a lot to be desired when it comes to encouraging players to play the game creatively. I spent a lot of time talking about boss fights, but what about other aspects of gameplay? General progression, mob battles, and world enemies? I'll leave this next section dedicated to this. I've praised the combat system of Cage 2 a lot, but that doesn't mean it's some flawless masterpiece that's only hindered by a lack of content to utilize it on. Many people have criticized the game for being unbalanced or having plenty of ways to cheese battles, and while I don't personally view cheese as a game-breaking deal for me as long as it's not a dominant strategy throughout the entire game, I can understand why others may look down upon it. I won't dwell too much on this though, because I think there are other slightly less subjective topics we can talk about. Mob battles and enemies you find through the worlds aren't discussed very often in Cage 2, but I think it's important to remember they're still a core element of gameplay. I don't actually have too much to complain about here. Most enemies are designed reasonably and have a creative set of attacks that require different methods to deal with them. I do have to take this time to bring up Crimson Jazzes though, probably one of the cruelest enemies they put in the main game. They're difficult to stagger, have disjoint hitboxes that follow you even after they're dead, and when paired up with other enemies often turns the game into a wild goose chase. Kill the Crimson Jazz before it can attack or suffer. I think this is also an opportunity to bring up the subject of Reflect and Magnet. Many people claim these two spells to be too powerful for what they are, but my opinions on this are a bit more complicated. Magnet is a difficult one for me, but I'm not sure whether I can consider it to be truly broken. The base Magnet spell is very weak and costs a lot. Enemies have to already be near you in order to be dragged into the Magnet. It's not until after Port Royal 2 that you obtain Magnera, which is definitely an upgrade from Magnet, but by then it's almost a necessary one because enemies you start facing become more aggressive and come in larger quantities. You need it to have some form of crowd control. While Magnera Finishing Leap is an extremely efficient combo that can steamroll through many of the second visit mob fights, I'd also argue there's a low execution barrier on understanding when and how to use it properly, a skill you develop for each of the enemies you fight. Mistiming your Magnet against Dragoons, for example, will result in a swift decapitation of Sora's head. We could spend time talking about the balance of this combo in more detail, but I think the more important takeaway is that on a blind or even subsequent playthroughs, this is still an unintuitive combo to figure out. This might be because learning the combo system isn't really incentivized in this game, or players don't understand how Magnet works as a finisher. Once again, a flaw of the game, being unable to teach the players how to utilize their tools, which I think is a much bigger and more fundamental issue. Magnega is the only level of Magnet I can consider overpowered, but by the time you receive it after defeating Luxord, its uses are pretty limited. The only relevant worlds in the game left at that point are Pride Lands 2, Hollow Bastion 3, Space Paranoids 2, Olympus Coliseum 2, Cavern of Remembrance, and the rest of the world that never was, along with the final battles. Of these listed, most players would have completed Olympus Coliseum, Hollow Bastion 3, and Space Paranoids 2 have Devastators that are immune to Magnet, the world that never was has Sorcerers that can attack you even when trapped in Magnet, Pride Lands have Shamans that can ignore Magnet during their spell, and Cavern of Remembrance has upgraded versions of all of these enemies, as well as Mad Rights, the upgraded version of Hot Rods, that resists Magnet, and I could be forgetting some as well. I think the point I'm trying to make here is that I don't believe Magnet is as brain dead of a crowd control spell as people make it out to be. I think this belief comes from people revisiting previous worlds and maybe synth grinding or something, which I don't see why you would be complaining in that position unless you want grinding for synthesis materials to be even more tedious than it already is. For casual gameplay, I find that Magnet hardly breaks the game throughout the story, and the unique utility of the magic spell actually leads to some really cool interactions with it, such as refilling the drive gauge quickly, comboing with other attacks and limits to deal extra damage, or even as a way to quickly reach your finishers. Reflect, on the other hand, is a whole other monster, but is also one of my favorite mechanics in the game. People are very quick to jump to the gun on Reflect, calling it broken and spammable. I do think the final damage output of Reflega is a bit too much, and I'll elaborate more on this later, but Reflect is also such a pivotal and central tool in Sora's arsenal that I can't imagine playing 2FM without it. This is because Reflect acts as a combo cancellation tool. I previously talked about how Cage 3 does a great job with base Sora's combos, allowing him to cancel his attacks into a guard or a dodge. You can't do this in Cage 2. However, what you can do is use Reflect in your combo. Because of this, Reflect is almost as important of a tool as the equivalent of Guard in Kingdom Hearts 3, and is what makes so many boss fights work in the first place. It acts as an emergency out in tight situations, allows you to quickly react to certain actions of the boss, and maybe even kind of justifies the unreactable retaliations some bosses have that I talked about previously. Maybe. This is also why I'm an advocate of having Sora learn Combo Master earlier on, or at the very least around mid-game where you are introduced to absent silhouettes. At this point, bosses can get more aggressive, and having a tool that allows Sora to essentially fuse offensive and defensive abilities seamlessly together would have made for some incredible potential with bosses, and you could even have fights designed around this idea if Combo Master was some permanent non-optional ability you gain. I think the problem with Reflect comes after when you obtain Reflega, which, to be completely fair, isn't until after you complete Space Paranoids 2. However, this is still enough for some players to go through the entire world that never was with Reflega, and many quickly discover the power of the spell in a fight like Roxas. I think this is where the notion of Reflect spam comes from, and it ties into another one of my points that I'd like to bring up. KH2 did something genius with its damage floor calculations. There's a base amount of damage you can deal depending on the battle level of each world, and if your strength is below that minimum, you'll be boosted up to that base. This works extremely well for low level or level 1 runs because it maintains the game's difficulty without making fights drawn out and boring. However, I can't say the same for the damage ceiling and the general curve of damage in worlds. If you play through the game and defeat most enemies you encounter on your way with no extra grinding otherwise, which is what I imagine most first time players will do, you'll end up in around your mid to high 40s by the time you get to the world that never was, or low 40s on critical mode. This is around the intended battle level of the world, but I think your damage is too high when you reach this point, especially on critical mode. Roxas' supposedly very difficult battle can be almost entirely spammed through with Reflega, and even without it becomes very easy to tank through most of his attacks. I really hope I'm not coming off as too elitist here, although I will acknowledge that once again my experience with the game may be interfering with my judgment. I think the point I'm trying to make is this: it's a good thing for games to have options for you in order to appeal to a larger player base. Those who want more of a challenge can choose to challenge themselves, while those who want an easier, more casual time can choose to make the game easier. However, the problem comes when this option is no longer a choice, and a player can accidentally make an irreversible decision that makes the game too easy, and no way to fix that. When I first played through critical mode, I had experience with KH2, quite a bit as a matter of fact, but I wasn't as good at the game as you may expect because much of that experience comes from playing the game as a kid, and because I was a kid I grinded a lot and over-leveled Sora whenever I got stuck. I played through critical mode casually defeating most of the enemies I encountered and had a relatively fun and challenging time. I did think the game slowly got easier over time, which I now realize was likely a creeping byproduct of my issue with damage ceilings being too high. I was slowly making the game too easy as I got my hands on more powerful tools. By the time I got to Roxas, I was expecting this difficult fight to wall me for a while, but I managed to get past him within just a few tries. Through a combination of spamming Reflega and accidentally discover a simple but foolproof loop, I turned one of the most difficult fights in the game into a cakewalk, barely learning anything about how the fight even works. In this playthrough, I tore through the world that never was despite being on the hardest difficulty, with pretty much no additional grinding. I had unintentionally ruined the challenge of critical mode for myself, all because I chose to fight some enemies throughout the game. I'm not sure where exactly this cutoff is, but I know for sure that being at the battle levels of the second visit worlds as shown from the world map is too high in my opinion. This also brings me back to my previous point. Reflega is too strong when you're at a reasonable level. On level 1, Reflect is never completely overpowered, and that stays consistent throughout the entire game because of the damage floor mechanic. However, on base critical mode, it's very easy to accidentally level yourself up to the point where, upon obtaining Reflega, you can tear through bars of health with just a few casts. And I think to players that are looking for more of a challenge, this may come as a nasty shock to them and devalue the feeling of beating some of these difficult fights by essentially flailing around mindlessly, spamming Reflect. Paired with the fact that there are virtually no attacks in the game that Reflect can't block makes it the ultimate and oftentimes only solution to most enemies in the game. Once again, this isn't a problem that everyone will encounter, and I'm sure a lot of it is based on player skill as well. I do believe the amount of damage you deal around the battle levels of the worlds should have been toned down, as well as the damage output of Reflega, because even the data bosses can feel like nearly trivial Reflect spam once you reach level 99, the intended battle level to face them. I honestly don't think this would be a bad change. Players who wish to have an easier time can play on lower difficulties or grind levels. However, if you're playing on critical mode, I think saying that you're playing the game for a fun challenge is a safe assumption to make. It's just a shame that it's possible, and as a matter of fact, very easy to unintentionally make the game too easy for yourself. So that's Kingdom Hearts 2. I think this game is phenomenal for many reasons, even outside of just nostalgia, and I think the majority of the community agrees with this sentiment as well. Kingdom Hearts 2 is consistently listed as one of the best games in the series, with hundreds of positive reviews praising the game for what it has done not only for the series, but for the action RPG genre as a whole. This video was meant to be another perspective, from someone who loves this game to death, trying to dissect its most prominent problems. And maybe, just maybe, I was able to communicate some meaningful message to you, like how we can still criticize the games we love, or something like that, I don't know. What I advocated for in this video might seem a bit ridiculous. It's essentially asking for more content, better content, to justify the game's incredible system that it has implemented. All of this from a decade-old game that provided quality content that's comparable to some of the best games today, especially for the price that you can get 2FM for. And because of this, I want to emphasize that this video should be treated as merely an analysis. I don't expect Square to go back in 2FM and add extra content, nor do I think the game is somehow not worth the price. As a product, 2FM is timeless and almost impossible to criticize. However, analyzing this game without the burden of legacy or a price mark means that I can talk about my favorite game without any restrictions, as well as all of the wishes I have for the game that's been built up over my years of experience. And perhaps a future Kingdom Hearts game can fulfill that dream.